Blue Zhaolin, plum blossoms fall. When the blossoms first emerge on plum ridges, the snow has not yet opened up on Heaven Mountain. Those snowy spots seem filled with flowers. Where flowers are, snow seems to swirl. Wind-blown, they enter the dancer's sleeves, mixed with powder, fall in ladies' chambers. Tens of thousands of miles away, the Xiongnu don't even know that spring has come. So this is the first poem we will be including in this expansion of 300 Tang poems by Lu Zhaolin. I think I will be including at least another one. Now, in the introduction we made in the video about Zhang Zhong, about these four great poets of early Tang, we explained that they basically lived and produced their main work in the 660s, 670s, 680s of the 7th century of our era, mostly during the period of Gaozong and of his wife and later Empress Wu Zetian. Lu Zhaolin belongs to the slightly older generation out of the group of these four worthies of the early Tang. He is like Luo Bingwang, older than the other two. And he lived until his 50s in these years that we have mentioned. He was from the northeast, actually from the area of what is current-day Beijing. And he was, a bookworm and a ferocious book reader who had exhausted the library of one of his patrons, one of the lesser kings of the imperial house, whom he served for a few years. But already from the 660s, I think he was at court, serving Emperor Gaozong, but he very early had to retire because of the onset of a terribly crippling disease that affected him, that paralyzed both his feet and both of his feet and one of his hands. He served for a brief spell in a very, very minor position in Shu in the west, and after that, because of his invalidity, he did not really go back to court. He dabbled into Taoist practices and lived in a mountain close to Luoyang, before committing suicide by throwing himself into the Ying River when the pain from his illness, which was probably some sort of rheumatic arthritis, caused him to decide to commit suicide and put an end to his suffering. Now, he has about 100 poems remaining. His best and most prestigious ones are generally full, so they would not find a spot in this anthology anyway. But he has about 100 poems with very different characteristics in style. Now, all of the four sages of the early Tang react to the courtly poetry that we explained in the previous video. So there was this hegemonic court poetry in the style of the late Six dynasties. It was a poetry that was impersonal, not extremely difficult to produce because any courtier was supposed to be able to master it. Very hermetic, and not because of having an excess of cultural references and intertextuality, but because the keys to understanding it and the ways of making it were part of the in-know of the aristocratic courtiers who lived in the court. It was pretty bland, always focusing on happiness and wishful thinking, and following pretty rigidly set forms and patterns of organizing the poetry and of subject matter, and not even of the choice of words. Now, all of the four poets react to this poetry in different ways, and they all supersede it or move it forwards with different techniques. So Luo Bingwan, who already appears in the 300 Tang poems, basically goes the way of exporting the techniques that he employed in parallel prose in Pianwen into Shi poetry, making it extremely erudite and difficult, even pedantic, and coded, and really difficult to read. Lu Zhaolin follows a different trend. His first poems, from probably before the time of the onset of his illness and while at court, are typical examples of the standard court poetry. But after the onset of his illness and his semi-exile, you could say, in Shu, his poetry changes in tone. So he still cultivates a lot of the typical court poetry type of poems, but he infuses them with new elements of intensity of feeling, of paradox, of dramatization, of fusion of contraries, which are not present in the original and which are especially visible in Lu Zhaolin's frontier poems. And he also sticks, even more so in his later poems when the illness has progressed a lot, on really the pressing imagery of dead trees. This wasn't completely original in him, other poets had done it, but he focuses on blasted landscapes, suffering and pain. And he inspires himself, for example, in the Chutzu, which are poems about scholar officials that are not being recognized and that are suffering. And he really keys up this emotional tone, which was rather subdued in the courtly poetry tradition. So the poem that we have today, Plum Blossoms Fall, is a bit of a paradoxical poem. In some aspects, it's very typical of the court poetry, but in others, it makes modifications. So first, Plum Blossoms Fall is based on a previous joyfu or ballad topic, and it plays, as you have seen, it's a poem that is basically describing the arrival of spring. Plum blossoms are associated with early spring because they're one of the first trees to emit flowers in late winter, early spring in China and Japan. So a time when late snows might still arrive. But here there is this juxtaposition. Plum blossoms are white, and when they cover the trees which are still leafless, they evoke very naturally the image of snow on the trees, on the branches, and so they're flowers like snow. Now this is a conceit, this is a metaphor that was played very frequently in Six Dynasties poetry. It became even a hackneyed topic that was later transplanted to the Japanese court poetry. This mitate, as they call it in Japanese, this elegant confusion between snow and plum blossoms. And this poem plays on that. So it's early spring, and it also juxtaposes two spaces. It's early spring in the northern barbarian lands. Snow is still there because the weather is harsher. In the southern, warmer Chinese lands, the plum blossoms have flourished and they look like snow. And this juxtaposition in the poem of the northern snow and the southern petals plays along, and it's continually referenced in a back and forth swing through the poem, whose topic could be describing early spring, but whose overtones include these contrasts, these juxtapositions of the world of the barbarians and the world of the Chinese. And so, in some aspects, it's very typical of classical courtly poetry, but on the others, it's very different. So, for example, court poems tend to conclude with a sort of witty statement or summarization or direct expression of the feelings of the poem and the poet, but here the poem ends on a rather open image, with a strange image, which we will comment in the last couplet, of the barbarian showing you amid the snow. And this poem, as we mentioned, uses very heavily a lot of paradox in that elegant confusion, but it is made extensive and consistent. It's not just an image, plum blossoms mistaken for snow. It's really the image, this juxtaposition of blossoms and snow, barbarians and Chinese, which is really exploited all through the poem with a certain element of dramatization and paradox, and a fusion of these contrary worlds. So let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. When the blossoms first emerge on plum ridges, the snow has not yet opened up on Heaven Mountain. So we start with two spaces. When this happens, this hasn't happened yet. So in the south, when the blossoms are emerging on the plum ridges, so it's early spring, the first blossoms appear. In the north, this Heaven Mountain, Tian Shan, is one of the mountains in Central Asia, in barbarian territory beyond the Chinese Pale. There, the snow is still extremely thick because, in the steppe, you have a harsher continental climate, which is much colder than the Chinese. So no signs of spring in the north. And the presence of seasons is also used regularly in Chinese poetry as an indication of the civilized landscape of the civilized peoples. That is, in China you have the 4 seasons, but in the barbarian north you just have extreme cold and extreme heat, and no vegetation, just blasted landscapes of sand and snow. So the first couplet made the presentation, and it presented as the ridges with plum blossoms here and the snows on the north. Second couplet, those snowy spots seem filled with flowers. Where flowers are, snow seems to swirl. So the second couplet, once we are located in this dichotomy of northern snow, southern blossoms, plays with the apparent paradoxical intermingling or confusion between the 2 elements. So in the south, we have flowers, but when their petals fall, it feels as if snow is swirling, and vice versa. In the north, when you see or when you imagine seeing a blasted tree with the branches covered with snow, it looks as if they were covered with flowers. So there's this elegant mixing and confusion of 2 worlds that are not only geographically, but conceptually and culturally miles apart. Third couplet. The third couplet seems to move us back into the south. So, wind blown, they enter the dancers' sleeves, mixed with powder fall in ladies' chambers. So we're getting images of the typical cultural practices of the south. So this is the world of the court, the world of what had been southern China, but now in a unified Tang Empire was also the world of the court and of the high culture of the whole empire. Whereas you could say the feminine south in China is represented with these dancers dancing, ladies' chambers, these petals flowing into the sleeves of the dancers and being mixed with the perfume that the ladies apply. These are images that perfectly fit the topics of the new songs from the Jade Terrace anthology of Southern poetry, with women, beautiful women languishing and doing things in boudoirs. So while the flowers are doing this, the flower petals in the south are doing this and, by extension participating in these cultural and refined practices of the south, what's happening north, that is what the last couplet tells us. Tens of thousands of miles away, the Xiongnu don't even know that spring has come. So whereas the first and second couplet present a juxtaposition jumping in one line to the north and in the other to the south, in the last 2 couplets, the third couplet depicts the south, and the fourth couplet takes us back and concludes in the north, in the area of the barbarians. Xiongnu, fancy name for the barbarians. It was the name of the barbarians that during the western and eastern hand pressured the northern frontiers. At the time of the Tang, they were Turks. They weren't Xiongnu anymore. The Xiongnu had disappeared. But it becomes a conventional trope of calling the northern barbarians the Xiongnu. So the Xiongnu don't know that spring has come, while the south is in full swing, enjoying the pleasures of spring, the plum blossoms, the dancing, the perfumes, the women in the chambers. So an interesting contrast all throughout the poem, and these traditional metaphors are strengthening the identities and pointing up the distinctions. So very interesting, and in a way, a very good representation of the court poetry, but also of some initial elements that are steering us away from it. So this poem in this translation was by Stephen Owen, and it's part of his volume on the early Tang, the poetry of the early Tang. And we will be reading very soon another slightly longer poem of Zhaolin, also translated by Stephen Owen.